Welcome back to the P3 podcast. As always, I'm your host, Alicia Reeve. Now, today we're going to be getting a little bit philosophical when it comes to the topic that we're discussing. But before we get into today's topic, I do have a huge favour to ask you. Well, it's not huge, it'll take you about 0.5 of a second. If you are one of the few hundred people that follow us on Spotify especially, if you could leave us a review, it would help us out immensely to reach a wider audience. So the more people that we have as part of the P3 community, the bigger the community grows, the more support we have, and then the more topics and educational content we can cover and provide. Now, secondly, we do have some massive CPD announcements that have come out in the last few months. So a number of our online courses have now achieved multiple CPD endorsements from either the Australian Podiatry Association, and now we've got Exercise Therapies in Podiatry Practice Pro is now a recognised CPD activity through the Royal College of Podiatry based in the UK. So over the next month until the end of October, members of the Royal College can access Exercise Therapies in Podiatric Practice, the Pro version, at a 20% discount. Now, our new monthly subscription, Athletic Footwear for Health Professionals, has also been given APOD A CPD endorsement, so similar situation. If you're an APOD A member, you can secure your first 12 months membership to Athletic Footwear for Health Professionals, saving you 20% off that as well. Now, that's enough of our self-promo and plugging, but all of your support means a huge amount to me and the P3 contributors. So if you can like, subscribe, share, help the community grow, hugely appreciative. So moving on from there. Over the last couple of weeks, now that we're getting towards the end of the year, I've been having multiple conversations with not just final year podiatry students, but also just some clinicians that are in that position where they're starting to reflect on where their career's gone, where it may want to head to. And there's a number of people that are exploring different employment and job opportunities. Now, oftentimes people will come to me and ask the question, is this job right for me? And the answer is, well, it depends. So today we're going to be exploring wants versus needs and how this can be a secret to identifying if a job is going to be satisfying and fulfilling and save us some headaches in the long run. So let's get into it. The Progressive Podiatry Project, here to share knowledge, insights and information for you to improve your clinical practice and, most importantly, help you help your clients. So why this is an important topic that I've decided to discuss today, like I mentioned, it's a conversation I've had over and over again over the last few weeks. And if we stop and think about it, the decision to accept a job offer, it's not merely a professional choice. Our job has the potential to significantly influence our personal life and our overall well-being, especially our mental health. And there's countless papers and works and theories that explore the conceptual frameworks that surround employment satisfaction, its links to health and well-being, and the different elements that will feed into this. But I think the first thing that we need to do is get clear on what our wants versus our needs are. And this is essentially what builds the fundamental basis for whether or not we are compatible with a potential job opportunity. So first up, we have needs. Needs are the absolute essentials that we need to have. And the needs, you can look at these like our non-negotiables. So it's almost like dating. So there's our definite non-negotiables that under no circumstance should we flex on these. And the needs, there are some universal needs that extend to almost everyone. But then, like our interpersonal relationships in the dating world, there are some needs that are going to be different from person to person. And essentially, whatever it is, whether or not it's the universal needs or our individual needs, these are the bare minimum that we need to accept for an employment opportunity before we even start to consider what our wants are. So with wants we can almost look at as our desires. So the bells and whistles beyond the fundamental needs. So if we're looking at needs, it's more the bare essentials, like I said. So a livable wage, a safe work environment, if we have clear roles and responsibilities, are we or is the job flexible surrounding what else is happening in our personal lives? And then we have the wants, so the bells and whistles. So this may be additional bonuses or incentives. It may be the potential to have a little bit of a fancy title, so roles that carry prestige, if that's something that floats your boat. It's not for everyone, but that's why wants are a little bit different. And then there's other opportunities that come from the wants. So do we have the opportunity to travel if you're someone that's something that would enhance your employment experience? And then if there's specific types of resources available or specific workspaces that you work in. So is it a really flash modern clinic, or is it a clinic that you have access to a gym? So again, the wants will vary a little bit from person to person, but the needs are the core elements that I think sometimes we can go, well, I've certainly done this, and that's why it depends on your point of view, but I guess I have some insight into this. And that is because over the last sort of 20 odd years of my working life, there have been times that I've flexed when I shouldn't have when it comes to my needs, and you learn from experience. And it's becoming more and more apparent as I accumulate birthdays how important it is for us to identify our needs, to not flex on the needs, and essentially just honor that before we get into an employment arrangement where later on down the track it may be something that is fundamentally just not suited to us at all, essentially becoming nightmare fuel, and it can wreak havoc on our mental health and well-being. So as I mentioned, there are some needs, so remember the bare essentials, that these will be almost universal across everyone. And then some of the needs will vary somewhat from person to person, depending on your personality, your needs, your life circumstance, and so on. And then the wants are highly individual, and they enhance the work experience more so than creating the fundamental foundation of whether or not we're even compatible with having a job that is going to fulfill us financially, emotionally, all of those bits and pieces. So today we're not going to explore the wants. We are going to focus on the needs. And in order to identify what our individual needs are, and if a prospective job opportunity or employment opportunity may be able to meet those needs, there's 5 questions that I feel that we need to consider in order for us to identify this. So the first one, does the remuneration cover my basic living needs? So if you're someone that lives way above your means, then you may need to do a little bit of self-reflection on those spending habits, especially in this financial climate. But okay, just in general, our basic living needs. So how much does it cost me to survive as a human being in whatever society that I'm living in? Then number 2, is this job stable, safe, and secure? Very, very important. Then thirdly, does the workplace culture resonate with my values? These can be your personal, but also your professional values. 4, will I be recognized, supported, and validated for my work? Also very important. And then number 5, are there growth opportunities within this role? Now, if anyone's familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you'll probably see that this reflects that. So for those that don't know, in 1943, an American psychologist, Abraham Maslow, he proposed a theory of human motivation, which is now commonly referred to as Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And then with this, the hierarchy outlines 5 needs that contribute to an individual's motivation and their fulfillment. And the basic premise of this is, it's almost like the food pyramid, all right? So the basic premise of the motivational hierarchy is that for an individual to be motivated and to progress to the upper levels, the base levels need to be fulfilled. So the most important, kind of like our grains and the healthy foods for the food pyramid, is our basic physiological needs. Now, this is the Maslow's hierarchy. We haven't applied it to the occupational setting just yet. So we've got our basic physiological needs. So that's food, water, shelter. Then we've got safety and security as the next tier. Then our social needs and that sense of belonging. Then above this, our esteem needs. And then the top tier is our self-actualization. So when everything else is fundamentally well and good, how we can excel and thrive as human beings. Now, it stands to reason, if you're someone who is living in extreme poverty and you're struggling to survive, even just finding shelter, food and water, then you're not really going to be hyper-focused on the self-actualization and your self-esteem. You've got bigger things to worry about. So that's Maslow's hierarchy. And then what's been done over the last, well, a couple of decades actually, is they've been taking Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and then there's a few other conceptual frameworks. So we've got like Christina Maslach's burnout inventory, which we'll explore another time. But essentially what they've done is they've taken Maslow's hierarchy and applied it to occupational settings. And so this is now commonly referred to as Maslow's hierarchy of employee engagement. And so if we're comparing and contrasting, now if you are a visual person, I would recommend heading to progressivepodiatryproject.com, having a look at our blog, because I've put together a couple of infographics there. But if you're an auditory learner, you're here. So if we're looking at the pyramid, we've got our organizational hierarchy as well. So the base level, so the most important, is essentially things like our salary. Then we've got our stable and safe working environment. Beyond this, we've got our working relationships. Then beyond this, things like that come with prestige almost, so like our job title. And then the top, our self-actualization, so thriving and achieving all of our career goals. Okay, so now we have a basic understanding of the hierarchy and then how it's conceptually looked at in an occupational setting. We're going to do a little bit of self-reflection and exploration of each of these 5 questions. So hopefully by the end of this episode, at the very least, you've identified kind of what your basic needs are, and then you can take this information and contrast it to some potential job opportunities that you're exploring to see if you do have that fundamental compatibility. Okay, so number 1, does the remuneration cover my basic living needs? Now, there's a few subset questions that we can explore within this. And I think first up, which is most important, is to identify what your actual basic living needs are. Especially these days when we're such a credit and cashless focused society, it's very easy to just pay past your life away and not really have your finger on the pulse as far as what your expenditure is week to week. So having a look at what your budget is, your living expenses, rent, mortgage, whatever it is, your bills, the essential outgoings, health insurance, if you have pets, how much does it cost to feed them? Thank God my dog is not huge, because at 13 kilos, she's still kind of expensive. Okay, so we've got our basic level of income that we need to meet those fundamental needs. Okay, then we need to ask a question, how much am I going to be paid? Is this going to cover my basic living needs? Now, it's very interesting, especially in Australia. One of the biggest problems that we see, so they always report on unemployment rates, but unemployment is very different to underemployment. Now, through a huge amount of the coaching that I've done with people over the last 12 months, underemployment is one of which, and also this is very strange considering that we have such a workforce shortage in healthcare, but there's so many clinicians I see that they're joining clinics, they're working in these clinics, but they're underemployed. So they're either not being given enough hours or their pay isn't enough to meet their basic living requirements. Now, the next question, which again in that theme of private practice, is will I be required to do work out of hours, and or is there an expectation for me to do unpaid work? Now, again, this happens more so in private practice, and it, in my opinion, is quite toxic. So why I think it's toxic is a lot of private practice owners, they fail to recognize and consider that no one is going to care more about your business than you do. You can't expect business owner levels of dedication and unpaid hours and the blood, sweat and tears from your paid employees. It is so different, and I think it's an unrealistic expectation, and it does perpetuate some of these toxic work environments. So whilst it is a very personal decision on how much you are willing to do outside of work, and there are always going to be instances where you may need to stay back an extra half hour to an hour to catch up on paperwork if the wheels have just fallen off the day, which they inevitably do. It's just, is there going to be an ongoing obligation and or expectation for you to do things above and beyond what you're actually getting paid for? This is very important to consider if you're entering into a sort of contract or commission-based arrangement. So for some people it works really well, for other people not so much, especially when you've got these employers that are expecting you to go out and do innumerable hours of legwork to build up your patient base just so you can see patients within the clinic. So do 10 hours of marketing work for free, but to see maybe 1 or 2 patients in the clinic. So I don't agree with that. But anyway, it's a very personal decision. However, I do think that it's very important to keep at the forefront of your mind that you will be an employee, you're not a volunteer. So we are always, like I said, going to have to do that little bit of extra work at times, but falling into that habit early on and bending to that expectation of having to absolutely annihilate yourself as far as time goes, emotional energy, everything like that, just to see some patients. It's something that I don't feel it's sustainable for a lot of people. For some people it is, and it works really well. Again, it's my opinion. That's why we're here on my channel. But it's just trying to provide people with some information that at this point in time, it may not feel relevant, but it does actually become relevant once you've accrued days, weeks, months, years potentially of doing innumerable hours of unpaid out of hours work, if that makes sense. So another thing that's important to consider, and it depends on how you go with maintaining and sticking to a budget. It's how frequently will I be paid? So if you're someone who is going to be paid monthly for this job opportunity, but budgeting is not your friend, are you going to be comfortable with living the high life for a week and then trickling down 3 or 4 weeks later and living on 2-minute noodles and then rinsing and repeating that cycle? Or are you someone that you can budget your paycheck to cater to the different intervals that you may have outgoing expenses? So it's not make or break for a lot of people, but for some people, getting a little bit real as far as how well you do budget, how you can stick to a budget and how you manage your finances, it can be very important. So for me, I have no issue with that. I can get paid once every 3 months and budget for the entire time and not be skint, because that's just who I am and how I work. But I know it doesn't work for some people. And even some friends I have that it's 20 years down the track, they still can't do that. So we're all fundamentally so different. So it's not a criticism for everyone. It's just being real and reflective about who we are, what we do, what we need. And then another one that's quite important is, like I mentioned before, just with that commission-based arrangement. So depending on the clinic that you go into, it does vary. So there are some commission-based arrangements where there's an existing client base that you're going to be walking into and taking over. That's a little bit different to joining a practice when then they're putting the onus on you to build up your patient base, especially if they're seeing it as they're looking at you like you're an employee, so they have that kind of control over your hours and what you do, but then expecting all of this extra legwork for you to build up your patient base. That's where I think, like, thank God there's been some changes and a little bit more of a crackdown on this, but it still does exist. Now, for some people, I think the biggest question to ask yourself, if you are thinking about entering into a commission-based or contract arrangement like that, is, are you comfortable with the potential that your income could be zero? That's a very real possibility. Now, it doesn't always exist for people, but for example, I joined a clinic quite a number of years ago, about 12 months before COVID kicked in. I didn't want to, I preferred an hourly arrangement, but this is something that I buckled on. COVID came, no one had any control over that. But essentially, I was commission based and doing essentially just all musculoskeletal and sports work. And then COVID came, SA, there was no sport. So no sport, no injuries really, and it wasn't an essential service. So I essentially had no clients. So seeing your income go to zero literally overnight and then maintain that for quite a while, immensely stressful. But I wasn't on my own in that situation. There were millions of us in that position. However, it's something to really ask yourself, do you have a financial buffer, or are you comfortable with the potential, if you enter into a commission-based arrangement, that your income could be zero almost overnight? So that's important. Now, possibly the last question to ask yourself within this tier, like there's always going to be more and more questions, but again, there's only so much we can cover in an episode. So one that's quite important is how far is the commute, and also what is the method of transport. So I think it was based in the UK, but they did a community and wellbeing study that explored lots of different elements of how the commute to work impacts people's health and mental well-being. Now, one of the commonly used quotes from this study is an additional 20 minutes of commuting per day has the same negative effect on job satisfaction as receiving a 19% pay cut. Now, I know that life circumstance happens, and at the minute, especially in Australia with the cost of living, it can be quite difficult to get accommodation or live as close to work as humanly possible. So it is the reality that there is going to be a commute for a lot of people. However, that is something, like for me especially, I know it's different for other people, for me especially, if there's a long commute, it becomes very soul destroying very quickly. Other people, they're fine with it, but that's something to consider, because you may have your 8-hour workday, but then if there's an extra 2.5 hours on top of that, that's potentially eating into time that you would spend with your family, playing sport, going to the gym, whatever it is, that is something that should not be overlooked, because it may be a very attractive pay packet and a great job opportunity. But if you're going to be sacrificing so much of yourself that exists outside of work, again, time with friends, time with family, time playing sport, if you're going to be sacrificing all of these other things that make us fundamentally who we are, then is it really worth it? So it's something that even earlier this year, there was one recent graduate that I was chatting to about a few job opportunities that he was tossing up. And this was one of the elements that I really honed in on, and he was like, oh, no, it'll be okay. Ended up taking a job that was double the distance of some of these other ones. And all up, most days it was almost a 2-hour commute once you're there and back. And within a few weeks, it was, shit, I really don't know if I can sustain this, because it's affecting life. So it's something that should be considered, but is very much overlooked in a lot of situations. So moving on from that, we're moving up to the next tier. So we've done the bottom tier, now we're on tier 4. So this is the job stable, safe, and secure? So similar to the commission-based arrangement I just mentioned, it's also, does this job have stable days and hours? So why this becomes important is, like I was just saying, in regards to the commute, is are you able to plan your life around your work hours? Is it going to change at the drop of a hat, or do you know what you're doing or where you're going to be week in, week out? Now, for some people, they thrive in the immensely variable working conditions and shift work and things like that. I definitely don't. But it becomes very important if you have other commitments. Now, it's always important, and I think it's something that when we're younger, we can overlook very easily, because we're so motivated. We want to progress our careers and make leaps and bounds of progress when it comes to our career progression. But then as we accumulate birthdays and get a little bit older, you begin to realize that it's the things outside of work that actually are what gives us a lot of the time our satisfaction and fulfillment. Now, this is coming from someone who, I love my work. What I do, especially with P3, I'm immensely passionate about it, and I do have an issue with switching off and not working, but I've also realized over time that that's not my identity. So fostering and nurturing our interpersonal relationships, making time for physical activity and things that we enjoy. So me going for a run, going to the gym, taking photographs, walking my dog, doing all of those bits and pieces. I've realized that that's something that if I'm long term, if it's a few days every now and again, doesn't matter so much. But if long term I've got an expectation or I'm creating a situation where those elements are going to suffer, for me it becomes not worth it very, very quickly. So if you've got children or you play a sport, so you definitely play football on Saturdays or football training is Tuesday evenings or touch footy, whatever it is, if you have things that deliver an immense amount of satisfaction to you, you enjoy it and it gives you such a positive experience and enhances your quality of life, I would argue that taking on a job that is going to take that away from you would need a lot of consideration, because it depends on, like, it does vary depending on sort of our financial situation, but and what this need, like all of these, it does vary. There's nuance from person to person, but it is important. But also outside of that, if you have children, do you need to be available to pick up your children at whatever time from after school or after school care, whatever it is? It's just what's happening outside of your life can work around that. Or do you have this expectation that you've got to juggle every element of your life around that? There is opportunity for compromise, but just be mindful of how much, because it's that there. And not every organisation or clinic owner is going to be like this, but there are instances where you give an inch, a mile will definitely be taken. But self-reflection. So these are just helping you become a little bit more aware. So there's no hard and fast or right or wrong answer here. Now, another thing that really does play into the potential long-term satisfaction are the roles, responsibilities, and sort of even my goals. So are the roles and responsibilities of all the staff clearly defined? Are there policies and procedures in place? And then are my goals clearly defined? So what am I doing? What am I working towards? Now, whilst not every single thing in our day-to-day life requires structure, because monotony is also an engagement killer, but there are elements within our workplace that require standardization and some element of procedure to this. So it essentially just ensures we're not walking into a stressful shit show every single day, because that quickly erodes our sense of sanity, really, very, very quickly. So whilst not everything does need a strict policy and procedure, so this, if we're talking about individualization of treatment, we should be following a framework, not a strict procedure, because that can erode some of those elements of individualized care. I'm talking about the everyday running of the business, because there are instances, if no one knows, oh, well, where do we order this from? Who's meant to do this? Are there any grievances? If there's a real discombobulation of just the day-to-day running, it over time can become incredibly stressful to work in those environments, especially if you're going into a situation where you're not going to have any control over improving those situations. Where I've worked in some clinics that have been overly procedural, where it essentially was just cookie cutter, and that didn't work for me because it kind of eroded that individualization of care. But then on the flip side, I've gone into clinics where there was no policy or procedure that existed for almost anything. So it was just every time you went to do something, and the clinic had been in existence for quite a number of years, but every time you went to do something, no one had any idea what to do. So just to do one simple task, it was just the complete mental slog of figuring out how to do it, where to go to get it done. And when that's not within your actual job description, and you've got to do that even for the most simple task, times that by 10, 15, 20 times, it just adds an element of stress that doesn't need to be there. So another thing that falls within this are there any KPIs that you're expected to meet? Now, KPIs, that's another rabbit hole that we can fall down another day, because there are some measures of performance that I feel can be quite beneficial to those of us in clinical practice. Do I agree with financial KPIs? No, not in any way, shape or form. But other KPIs, they become important, even just for that patient care and level of satisfaction for our patients. But anyway, KPIs. So are there some that are in place? Are they stable metrics, and are they reviewed, and what are they reviewed against? Or is it something that may potentially change on a whim? So this week your employer thinks that this topic's important, so we're going to focus on that. And then next week that's more important, so we're going to focus on that. Now, I know that there are some clinics that exist where this does happen, and it does create a huge amount of stress for the employees. But even looking at that on a bigger scale, when I was doing some of the workers' compensation work a number of years ago, that was something that was immensely stressful. So we'd have a meeting with all of the case managers, and the powers that be further up the food chain would go, okay, we're dropping these KPIs, so everyone needs to change this policy, not this policy, sorry, this procedure, that procedure, do this, do this, do this to meet that KPI. So then you'd spend a few weeks changing everything that you're doing and creating a huge amount of work just to change things for these 20 or 30 established cases that you're working on. And then the next meeting, oh, well, that hasn't worked, so now we've got to look at this KPI. So then you're swinging right back. And it was just an absolute shit show, if I'm being honest. So it's something that if you're constantly changing the goalposts, then what are you doing? You need to have that stability. So whilst in these circumstances, you're never really going to know if you're walking into a situation where the goalposts will continue to change until you've actually been in the job for a while and you've seen the goalposts change. But there's one way that you can identify potentially if this is going to be a problem is what the onboarding process and even just the job application process is like. So the onboarding process especially is a very, very good indicator on how well an organisation will provide stability, clarity and structure across all the different levels of the hierarchy, especially as you start to move through the upper tiers for career progression. So essentially, if there's poor onboarding, you can almost guarantee that much of the day-to-day running of the organisation is done on the fly. So poor onboarding is if you kind of you're there on day one and then you get thrown in the deep end and it's sink or swim. That will essentially be how your employment or time at the organisation is going to be, sink or swim. But then if you've got someone or an organisation that you're joining, that even the application process, there's really clear expectations that are outlined and there's a lot of communication and this is what you'll be doing, this is how we do this. If it's really structured and organised, then you can almost guarantee that the day-to-day organisation and structure is going to be quite sound. So, and it goes across, I've worked in small clinics where I've been the only other practitioner. My clinic, when I had it and first started, I was the only practitioner. I've worked in some big multidisciplinary clinics that have dozens of health practitioners employed, and then I've worked in insurance organisations that have hundreds of people employed. Now, the bigger the organisation doesn't mean the better the onboarding. You can still be working in a complete shit show even if there are 400 people that work there. So it's just a very good thing to be able to identify. So onboarding, you've typically accepted the job offer, but even as you're going through the employment process, the questions that they ask, how the interviews are structured, that will start to give you a feel of how much organisation exists within the organisation, if that makes sense. So another thing that, again, reflecting back on the contract and the sort of commission-based arrangements, is how far ahead of time will I know whether or not the contract is going to be extended? So this comes into that security element, because especially if you have a number of financial commitments, for example, a mortgage, if you've got a number of financial commitments and you're not going to be knowing if you have a job in 2 weeks' time because they're not sure whether or not they're going to renew the contract, that is something that, and this is outside of if you've done anything to essentially validate being terminated. So if you're doing a good job and you potentially could stay within the organisation, how far ahead of time will you actually know so you can plan your life? That's just a finer point, but it's something that I'd say 98% of people don't need to worry about. But then the 2% that do need to worry about it, and they're in a situation where they begin to worry about it, it can be immensely stressful and it impacts so many other elements of your life. So that's just a little thing to keep in mind if you are looking at these type of arrangements. And then another thing that's very important, and I think especially for, like, it extends to male practitioners, but especially female practitioners, this isn't really an opportunity to get into gender arguments, but regardless of your gender, are you going to be working in an environment where your safety will be put at risk in any way? And if there are potential risks to your safety, what policies, procedures, and things are done, or safety measures are in place to help increase your chance of being able to perform your job safely? So what we see mostly in allied health is working in, well, podiatry especially, our sort of little sphere. Are we going to be working in a dementia unit, and are there residents that may have a little bit of a propensity for getting physical or violent? If that's the case, how is that risk mitigated by not just the residential facility, but also our employer? And then it was similar to, like, on a different scale. So that was one thing that procedurally was done quite well when I was working in the insurance job, because that was a very volatile industry. So threats of violence were quite frequent, disturbingly frequent. So they did have a large number of policies and procedures and safety measures in place for that. So that they did very, very well, but they always get put in place because there are incidents that happen that require that, right? But I think for looking at it through the allied health lens, it's more so, am I going to be going to aged care facilities or facilities where I'm working with people that could potentially put my safety at risk? But then not just that, it's if you're doing home visits. This is very important, again, for male and female, but very much for females. If you're doing home visits, what are the safety measures that are actually in place to ensure that you can conduct that home visit safely? So who else will be in the home when you're there? So this isn't to put the fear of God into people. It is a realistic thing that we need to consider that is often overlooked. So just if you are going to be going off-site to a clinic, or there are going to be instances where you'll be in the clinic on your own, what are the procedures that exist to allow you to do that safely? Now, as we're moving further up the pyramid, this is where we start to become a little bit more individualized and nuanced with what our needs are. So number 3, we're in the middle of the tier. So does the workplace culture resonate with my values? So at the core of every organization is its culture. And this is the set of shared beliefs, attitudes, values, and practices that define it. And then for individuals, our values serve as almost as our compass. So they guide our behaviors, our decisions, and our interactions through our day-to-day lives. So some of these elements will relate to business practices of the organization, and then others will be relating to just more of the internal working relationships of people that are already in the organization. But overall, they essentially align with the more social needs of the hierarchy. And so before you can determine if a workplace's culture aligns with your values, you actually need to have an understanding of what your values are. So, for example, are you someone that values integrity, honesty, altruism, autonomy, collaboration, growth, and continuous learning. So they're all values that, for me, are quite important. So they're the examples that I'm using. So when our values align with an organization's, it essentially just fosters a really harmonious working relationship. But when it doesn't, and you're working in an organization where your values aren't aligned, it can really quickly erode your sense of well-being, because there's so many elements that it does start to impact. So even like our purpose, why am I here? What am I doing? Because if it's not fulfilling a fundamental need that you have to achieve that sense of purpose, it just kind of becomes dead space. So we've got our personal values, yes, and then the values of an organization. So what some of these may look like is, first example would be the mission and the vision of the organization. So it's essentially the organization's purpose and their long-term goals. Now, a really good quote that I'm probably going to bastardize, but one that I've heard time and time again, is people will join an organization for its vision and then they'll leave because of management. And that is so true. If we start to think about the different examples and what we've already discussed so far through this episode, and that's kind of the procedural shit show that you may be walking into. Are there continually moving goalposts as far as your KPIs? Are there no policies and procedures in place? So you may join an organization, which I've done, because on paper and in theory, it's a dream job, dream clientele. You've got all this autonomy, you've got this, and this, but then the day-to-day running is just nightmare fuel, basically. So the mission and the vision. So how well do you align with what the organization is hoping to achieve? And this is things like, how do they work best to serve their clients? Who are their clients? What's their ideal patient demographic? How are they serving them? So what value adds do they do? What treatments do they provide? Does that align with your treatment ethos, but even just how you interact with humans, basically? And then, like I just touched on before, so another example is the leadership style. So there is a very distinct difference between a leader and a manager. So when you have a manager, it's often a top-down approach. And then leaders, they're there, they're working in the coalface with you, essentially, and they lead. So they're quite supportive. They can be really enriching to work with and for. So it's often something that can be hard to determine until you're in the role, because there are some things, like we've already discussed, that until you're actually working within the role, you don't know if it exists or not. But a lot of the times you may get a sense of the type of leadership style you may be working with, even just based on the application process. So the questions that they ask, are they interested in what you're interested in and how you would like to grow and how you would like to contribute to the organization? Or is it more that top down, you are doing this, you're expected to do this? So, and for some people it works really well, that's what they want, but then for other people it may be an incompatibility. So again, there's no right or wrong answer, it's just being self-reflective and self-aware of what we need, because again, it does vary from person to person. So then there's another element that outlines kind of the values of an organization, and that's the communication and connection. Similar to what I just mentioned, is how transparent are they as far as the processes and decisions and just the expectations of who's doing what and how do we communicate about that. So, and oftentimes a really easy way to gauge the communication style of an organization is by gaining or gathering some information about how they approach employee reviews. So firstly, do they even have them? And secondly, what do they state that the purpose of these reviews are? Is it to make sure that we're on the same page, you're achieving your goals, you're meeting the expectations we've set out, or it's literally to make sure that you're not stuffing up and you're meeting your KPIs to make us money? No one will ever say that bluntly or blatantly, but essentially that's kind of the information that you're after there. So another thing, and this is where you start to see that there's more and more nuance as we progress up the food chain. So are you someone who really thrives in those working environments where you've got very close connections with all of your colleagues. So there's some people that they love to have after work drinks and do social activities with the people that they work with and all of those bonding activities. Now, I'm not against that, but I'm very much someone who work is work, and then I can really like my colleagues, and there's a lot of them that I may see outside of work, but the expectation of there's a lot of social time out of hours that you're kind of expected to bond with your workmates. It's very different. So some people, they love that and they thrive in environments where every week that we've got this social event and that social event and we're having dinner and we're doing this. That does not in any way resonate with me. Once every now and again, that's fine, but as an ongoing thing, no. So it's just being real on sort of what you need as far as that sort of social connection and social element within your workplace. If you're someone that you do need that and you do thrive on that, but you're essentially going to be working in a silo, it may become very lonely for you very quickly and just not having that support. And that's even outside of just as a new graduate or a recent graduate, that sort of mentoring and coaching that you may need. So it's the social elements. How much contact are you going to have in your work role as far as helping support you through that and grow within that? But then also what else is sort of expected or provided outside of that? Very different for everyone, but being quite aware of what your needs are or what you would like to have in that situation is very important. Now, there's a few other elements. So we've got recognition and rewards. So it varies from organisation to organisation, but that I would just encourage you to read the blog. Again, progressivepodiatryproject.com. But the next point, which I feel is quite important, is work-life balance. Now, I think work-life balance is bullshit. I think it's work-life boundaries, which is what we need, because it's not there's always going to be instances where something requires a little bit more attention. Some weeks that, and I like the four burners theory, but some weeks family takes priority over everything else. Other weeks it may be work is a little bit more pressing, and then interpersonal relationships, so the person, your husband, wife, spouse, person that you're dating, whatever. There are going to be instances where one thing requires more attention than the other, but like I was talking about right at the start, that out of hours time and unpaid time, is there an expectation of that? How much is work potentially going to bleed into your personal life? And that's something that I feel is very important. So what this may look like in a clinical sense is if you're only working part-time, but you've got a work email, are you expected to answer and respond to your work emails on days that you're not actually paid to be at work? And this is something that I've experienced, and it's awful. Like, if I'm not at work and I'm not on the clock, yes, there may be one or two emails that I may check in the couple of days that I'm not at work, but having an expectation that Monday through Saturday, 8 a.m. to 5 p.m, I'm going to respond to work emails when I'm only being paid for 10 hours a week, that's unrealistic and no chance. So it's just having that understanding of what the expectations are as far as when you're at work, you are doing this, and when you are not at work, you do, well, whatever you do outside of work, and what's the expectation of what you're meant to do in relation to your job when you're not in the workplace. So just some questions, that you need to ask about that are essentially those points. So are there any out of hours expectation or jobs out of hours that you expect me to do, like checking work emails or responding to inquiries or anything like that? Now, we're heading towards the upper elements of the tier. So number 4, we've got 2 more to go. So number 4, will I be recognized, supported, and validated for my work? So there's a couple of instances or elements within this we've already kind of discussed. So there's the reward systems, and then there's the open communication channels. So how you're able to share ideas, share feedback, get feedback from your employers, all of those. But the main thing that is most important that I want to focus on with this episode for our upcoming graduates is more so the mentorship programs. So existence of programs within an organization where you've got a more experienced professional guiding and nurturing new employees. So getting real on, and especially as a new graduate, you're going to need a fair amount of guidance. Now, it doesn't always have to be from someone within your organization. There's plenty of instances where you can get a mentor outside of your organization, but it helps to have someone within. Now, getting real and having a think about how much guidance do you want and or do you need being the operative word there. It's okay, so is there going to be time set aside every week, every fortnight, every month to have a chat with your employer, troubleshoot any problems? Are there any potential areas for upskilling that time's dedicated to that? So that's where it becomes really, really important for seeing how supported you may be in a workplace. So, and it's just really simple. You can ask when you're going through the job application process, is there any mentorship included with this employment package? If yes, what does it look like? If it's no, then is there potential for that to be included? And if the answer is still no, then okay, what's the expectation of how I'm meant to develop my skill set, and what do I do if I've got a tricky patient that I'm not being able to sort of figure out what to do? Who can I turn to? What time may I be able to access someone to be able to explore this? So that's really important for that. And then I think the last one, which this is where we're at our self-actualization, so we're at the top of the tier. So are there any growth opportunities within this role? Now, as a new graduate, you're going to be growing a phenomenal amount, hopefully, in the first few years, because you're going to be learning so much, because it is very different going from university land into practicing clinician land. So you're naturally going to be growing because you're going to be exposed to so many different clients with diverse clinical histories, personalities, all of those things. So it is quite an exciting time. However, if you're someone who you're very career focused, or you are someone who may have a little bit more experience under your belt and you're thinking about joining an organization, are there any potentials for growth? Now, this ties in somewhat with mentoring and the upper tiers. So from tier 3 to 1, these last three, it's a lot of those social elements have become a little bit intertwined, but you can see how these are more those nuanced elements that feed into our real fulfillment above those basic needs that we've been looking to see if they can be met. So when it comes to growth within an organization, there's a number of different ways that we can grow. So there's vertical growth, which is essentially moving up the food chain. So in a clinical setting, is it moving from clinician to a senior clinician that may have a bit more of a mentoring role? Then there's horizontal growth. So it may be as a clinician, taking on more managerial responsibility. So am I going to be seeing less patients and then doing some of the managerial work or marketing work, or something? Am I working on a different project where we're getting some, say, specialized equipment within the clinic, and am I going to be developing a training program for the rest of the staff with that? So that's a bit more of a horizontal growth. So you're still essentially the same level, you're just taking on slightly different tasks. Then there's, regardless of what tier or growth position that you're in, is there opportunities for skill and knowledge development? So this may be our mentorship programs, but it may be CPD allowances, or like I know with P3, there's a number of clinics that, especially with the exercise therapies course, and I think it's great to see, it's one of the things I was most excited about when it started happening, were there are a couple of clinics that they purchased the course for all of their staff members, and it's essentially just been intertwined as part of their mentoring program. Now, there's some clinics that have purchased it and then they've got their own staff that are running the other clinicians through the program. And then there's a couple of clinics where they've purchased the program and then it's every sort of 6 to 8 weeks we meet up. And so I'm kind of running the mentorship for them. So that's a lot of fun. I really enjoy that. But it doesn't have to be with anything to do with P3, but it's just, what does the job opportunity have available to you, whether or not it's in-house, or what support is given to you to seek additional skill and knowledge development. So And then there's network expansion and even just our own personal development. So is there, and this is where it varies so much, especially from clinic to clinic, is there opportunities, or is your employer supportive of you networking with other practitioners in the area, or do they just have that expectation, if you work for me, you don't talk to any of our competitors, which I think competitors is a bullshit way to look at things. But anyway, so that's just my wrap up. So we've gone through the Maslow's hierarchy, and hopefully that's given you a little bit of an insight into some of the self-reflections and exploration of the self-reflection to help identify if a job may be a little bit more suited to you than not. Now, whilst you never 100% know how compatible you are going to be with the job until you're actually working in it, it's essentially the most important takeaway that I want you to get from this episode is getting clear on your non-negotiables, because getting clear on the non-negotiables and then committing to not bending those rules is essentially going to be one of the fundamental things that will, at the very least, give you a chance of entering into an employment arrangement where you're going to be potentially fulfilled. So I know it's not exhaustive, it can't apply to every single person, but again, I hope it's given everyone a little bit of insight into maybe being able to discern some employment offers that you've got to whether or not you are truly compatible with it. Now, there are a couple of checklists and self-reflective questions that I've put in the actual blog that exists on the P3 website. So if you want to check that out, head to the website, progressivepodiatryproject.com. I know it's been a little bit of a long episode. I've actually really enjoyed it. This is a topic I'm very passionate about, and yeah, there is a project that I'm about 90,000 words deep in that's still probably going to take another year or two to get out there, but it does explore a lot of this really, really in depth. But I'd love to hear your feedback, and again, if you could do me a solid, follow us on the podcast or YouTube channels. Leave a review on the podcast channels, as it does help us grow. It's been great. I've really enjoyed it. I'll catch you next time. Cheers.